So today I'd like to look at a study by Nicholas Abrahamsson and Kenneth Hyltenstam. These are two Swedish researchers who did a study in 2008 on the robustness aptitude effects in near-native second language acquisition. They did their study on Swedish language learners in Sweden who had Spanish as a first language. These two Swedish researchers wanted to do a follow-up on Robert de Keyser's 2000 study. So here we can see a figure from de Keyser's study, and on the bottom here we can see the age of arrival for first language Hungarian speakers in the United States. And on the left, we can see their scores on a grammaticality judgment test. Now, for those individuals who arrived in the United States before the age of, I believe it was 15, most of them scored in this pocket up here. They scored fairly highly on the grammatical judgment test. After this age of about 15 or 16 years old, we see a much wider range of scores on the grammatical judgment test. Robert de Keyser gave a grammaticality judgment test and an aptitude test, as well as interviewed them. And the aptitude test gave some interesting findings. Well, we can see up here in this pocket right here, we've got some high scoring late onset learners. And what de Keyser was able to find was that for the majority of these individuals, they scored high on the aptitude test. There was one individual who also scored high, whose aptitude score was not whose verbal aptitude score was not as high, but this individual was also a postdoctorate studies. This person was also doing studies in postdoctorate studies on the natural sciences. So de Keyser believed that even though he didn't do so great on his verbal aptitude test, he had a higher analytical ability, which allowed him to have this increased language proficiency or grammatical understanding. So they wanted to ask a couple of research questions in their follow-up research. One, is it necessary for late onset learners to possess a high level of verbal and analytical ability in order to attain a non-perceivable, non-natus level of proficiency? Meaning that if someone can pass as being a native speaker, do they have to, and they are a late onset learner, is it necessary for them to have scored really highly on the verbal aptitude test? Two, if the speech of native-like late onset second language learners in the study are examined in linguistic detail, can we see that their speech is not in fact native-like? So the two Swedish researchers, Abrahamsson and Hyltenstam, wanted to go back and give a more difficult and thorough grammaticality judgment test to see if, and on closer inspection, they could see patterns that showed that, in fact, even though they could pass, their language was not the same as native speakers. And number three, for early onset learners who can pass as native speakers, is having a high verbal analytical ability as necessary as it is for late onset learners who can pass as native speakers. So they wanted to look and see if this pattern had some correlation with early onset learners as well, meaning do early onset learners also need high verbal aptitude in order to score well. So for this study, Abrahamsson and Hyltenstam wanted to isolate high proficiency speakers of Swedish who had Spanish as a first language and could pass as native in Swedish. So what they did is they put out an ad looking for volunteers who could pass for native. They had 195 people volunteer. These were divided into early onset learners with an age of onset between 1 and 11, and late onset learners with an age of onset between 12 and 47. They recorded the volunteers during an interview and a speech task, and then they took samples from about 20 native speakers of Swedish as a control group. All of these speech samples were then further reviewed by native speakers of Swedish who had no training in linguistics and who were given the task to try and pick out the imposters. When the native speakers reviewed the groups, they passed 87 individuals from the early onset group. 20 did not pass. From the late onset group, we see that 17 passed, big drop in numbers, and that 71 did not pass of the late onset learners. The early onset group was further lessened so that because of matching criteria, they wanted to be able to match against each other according to all the background criteria. So in the end, we had 31 members in the early onset group. It's a bigger group here in the early onset, and then 17 members in the late onset group. That's our total right there. So all these members, all these volunteers who could pass as native speakers were then given, they were given a lot of different tests, but for this study, they reported on the grammatical judgment test and the aptitude test. Now, the grammatical judgment test, as I may have mentioned before, was much more intense than the one in De Keyser, and to give more stricter confirmation of how close their ability was to native speakers. And they did this in order to prove what non-native speakers could not do instead of what they could do, which is kind of what De Keyser and Johnson and Newport were looking at. So much stricter grammatical judgment test and an aptitude test, which was based on the Carroll and Sapon study, some later work by Carroll, and then these the eventual test was made for Swedish. So it wasn't the original test that they made, but modified for Swedish speakers. So here we can look at the results of the study. And what we see is that here on the left, we see the grammatical judgment score for the Abrahamsson and Hyltenstam study. We see the grammatical judgment score. We see the age of onset. And notice on the left, we have these little squares, and these are actually the control group. These are the actual native speakers and how they scored on the grammatical judgment test. This is the lowest number here, the lowest score. And then we can see, unlike the De Keyser study, where it's just got this empty pocket almost here, with the more difficult and strenuous grammatical judgment test, we do have some more early onset learners peaking out, getting lower scores. We can also see, as we did in the De Keyser study, a bigger spread as we pass the age of 12. A bigger spread here on the grammatical judgment test. Again, we're seeing similar results to the De Keyser study. So what this shows is that when we look at the aptitude test, we can see again from all of the individuals here who could pass as native speakers, and here is our native speaker control. We can see that on our aptitude tests that all the individuals who could pass for native speakers who are late onset, all of them have a higher aptitude score. But for those individuals who are early onset, we have a much more wider spread in aptitude scores, showing that for early onset, the verbal aptitude is not necessary in order to pass as native, but as we get into later onset, a high verbal aptitude is necessary in order to develop the skills needed to pass as a native. So, here we are. Abrahamsson and Hyltenstam used a lot of methods and techniques that were used by other researchers, including Johnson and Newport and De Keyser. And because they did that, and because they based a lot of their methods on De Keyser, it helped validate what they were doing. It helped show that for all of these different studies, they're getting a lot of the similar results, and that this must be indicative of some phenomenon that is actually going on. In the case of reliability, there was one point that really made me think, which we can see if we look at this figure here. The researchers used a battery of different tests, and for this study they published the results of only a few, of which we can see two here. On our vertical axis, we can see the grammaticality judgment test scores for the written component. Here's our written component. And on our horizontal axis, we can see the scores for the grammaticality judgment test for the auditory component here. Notice how the score spread lines up neatly in the middle here. We've got this neat line right here. It creates a nice diagonal line right here. That is because if an individual scores well on the auditory component, they score similarly on the written component. So we can see here's the auditory and the written, they kind of line up nicely here. If they score low on the written component, they would score similarly on the auditory. We don't see scores up in here, because that would mean that an individual scored really high on the written but really low on the auditory, or really high on the auditory but really low in the written score, in the written version. So because we don't see a lot of things going on here, we can surmise that the tests are really consistent. The different tests are really consistent, which and that they're equally matched, which lends to the underlying reliability in the measures created for this study. There was some issues with the inter-rater agreement in the native speaker survey of the different groups. When the native speakers listened to the control group of Swedes, 18 out of 20 got a 10 out of 10. 2 individuals got a 9 out of 10. So even there, we had some slight disagreement. However, when they looked at the other groups, they had less agreement. They found that if they were to put the 9 out of 10 standard to the other groups, it would cut their sample sizes. This was especially true for the later onset group here. With only 5 individuals passing with age of onsets over 11 years, and no individuals passing with age of onsets over 17 years. So that would have completely erased their sample for later onsets group. So in order to overcome this, they dropped the 9 to 10 standard and made it down to a 6 out of 10 to keep the sample sizes reasonable. So just a majority was able to help these individuals get into the pass as native group. In conclusion, I have to be careful when comparing this study to my own project, because this study takes place in a naturalistic learning environment. Despite this, there are very important takeaways. One is that while we see that early age of onset creates some clear advantages in naturalistic learning environments, verbal aptitude also has advantages. When we begin to look at instructed settings in Japan, we may be tempted to think that test scores may show a clear advantage for early onset. But we have to be cautious and remember the intervening variable of high verbal aptitude. For my future project, I feel that if I can find data for a large enough population sample, I can perhaps drown out the effects of a small minority of high verbal aptitude participants to reveal any overall trends. Lastly, there is one interesting question that I'm left with from this study regarding high verbal aptitude learners. If you look back at figure 2, we can see that the early onset learners who had an age of onset of 1 year of age also all scored high on the verbal aptitude test. This begs the question, does this mean that earlier exposure to 2 languages helps develop high verbal aptitude in later life? In closing, this study helped us look at some really interesting questions and data and really helped to give us a bigger and fuller picture of second language acquisition in naturalistic settings. It also revealed some intervening variables to try and control for in my upcoming project. So thank you very much for listening today. Here are my references. Goodbye.